Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Matthews. I'm a PhD student of philosophy. Today the lecture is going to be about a classic from contemporary philosophy, a classic work from existentialist philosophy, which is Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism is Humanism, which was actually a lecture, a conference he gave in 1946, and later on was made into a book, a small book, which became very famous and made Sartre an international celebrity. Jean-Paul Sartre was perhaps the most influential thinker of post-war Europe, not only post-war France. And he was one of the many people who considered himself an existentialist at the time. And it was a time of a very difficult state of affairs in the world, right? It was we've had two wars. We've had a very tense conflict between the Russians and the US and the West and the East. You had the Holocaust, you had the Nazis, you had the fascists. So it was very much a philosophy that represented that time in human culture. What Sartre is trying to do here, as Beauvoir and, for example, the Ethics of Ambiguity, another great work of existentialism, is forge a morality that is not predicated on unjustified assumptions of reality, that deals with the concrete reality of human suffering, of wars, horrors that humanity is capable of its anguish. And Sartre is very much influenced by Heidegger. Martin Heidegger published Being and Time, Sinn und Zeit in German, around the beginning of the 20s and changed the philosophical landscape for the entire century. You're going to have Heidegger students like Hannah Arendt, for example, and a lot of pupils are going to go develop unique philosophies on various areas, and Heidegger himself was a disciple of Edmund Husserl, who was considered the founder of phenomenology, which was a new approach to philosophy and epistemology, especially, that didn't deal with subjects and objects. This epistemological game of dichotomy that's present in Aristotle, in Descartes or Kant, and everybody, Aquinas. And so phenomenology brings us back to the experience, our experience, concrete experience in the world, as presences, as Heidegger would put it, Dasein, the man thrown into existence. And that's going to be formulated by Sartre in this philosophy as our existence comes before our essence. For someone, let's say, like Thomas Aquinas, that would sound absolutely absurd, ridiculous. You're saying to me that the effect is greater than the cause, comes before the cause, is ontologically anterior to the cause. That's absurd, and no wonder. Absurdism is always going to be a philosophy in this time by Albert Camus, who was considered an existential philosopher, but he himself, just like Heidegger, did not consider himself as an existentialist, rather as an absurdist in the case of Camus. But it's very similar post-war philosophy. I'm actually more an Albert Camus kind of guy than a Sartre kind of guy, but some say Sartre was a better philosopher and Camus a better writer, and it was very common at the time for you to do both things, right? I myself, Matthews, I am interested in pursuing a career in fiction literature and also in philosophical literature and non-fiction books, right? So this is something very common nowadays. And the writing of essays, philosophical essays, and not that systematic, scholastic form of treatises. So this was about an introduction, okay, to existentialism. And it's also important to say that there is a distinction between religious existentialism and atheist existentialism. But I'm going to address that as we read Sartre's book, because he talks about that very earlier in the book. I would also like to say that this one is a very good philosophical starter pack kind of book, because it's very small and it's an easy reading. Sartre is trying to defend existentialism actually from the general public's critiques, and so he makes an effort to be very intelligible for everyone, not just philosophers, even though he considered existentialism as a very serious philosophical current and not just a kind of fashion of the epoch, let's say, which it also became. And this is also why Sartre felt the need to address the issue on existentialism in this conference and make it clear what it is not. And you're going to see that the book is called Existentialism is a Humanism, something that may sound contradictory, right? I mean, humanism, what is this? He's like Auguste Comte, positivism, enlightenment, secularism. No, that's not what it's about at all, and he's going to talk about that. Existentialism is not a doctrine that puts the end of humanity in itself. Humanity is not to be considered as magnificent. Otherwise, according to Sartre, it's a very risky turn to take that could lead to fascism at the end. So it's very dangerous to assume a position of humanism in a classical sense. So Sartre writes this book called Being and Nothing, which is very much predicated on Heidegger's Being and Time. And Heidegger, when he received it, he said, oh, this one is a good student. You know, he did not take Sartre to be doing something very original and independent of his own work, Being and Time. And honestly, Sartre is indeed very much reformulator of many of theses that you can already find in Heidegger than an original thinker. In my particular opinion, it's not as original as Camus, but it's more systematic and more robust, let's say. And he was also a very important guy to promote philosophy to the general public, to outside that erudition state of academia. His activism was very important, as well as a cultural figure of the intellectual who will be seen writing in the cafes of Paris and addressing political issues like Jean-Luc Godard and other intellectuals. So Simone de Beauvoir, a great thinker not only of feminism but also of existentialism by her own right, was married to Sartre, and it was like the intellectual couple and who had a very influential work during the mid 20th century to before the post-structuralists took over, the generation of Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, and so on. So let's get into the book. So Sartre starts talking about how much existentialism is seen in a distorted way by the public, as if it was just another type of pessimism that was kind of popular, and it was a sort of a cultural fashion from a melancholic state, let's say. He addresses many of the criticisms, one of which accused existentialism to be a philosophy that focused on the dark side of the human condition, like on the suffering, on the horrors, on the evil, and saw reality with a pessimistic lens. But Sartre says that it's not really the case, and he tries to explain. He says the question around existentialism is only complicated because there are two kinds of existentialists. So there's also this confusion, right, between who exactly is an existentialist. There is the Catholic guy who says he's an existentialist, and there's this atheist guy. It's really a case that both of these people are in the same boat. And Sartre is going to clarify very early on in the book that no, there are two kinds of existentialism. Many people point to Soren Kierkegaard as the founder of existentialism. But in the time of this Danish religious thinker, very important one for psychology as well, it was not a cultural movement. He was a thinker of the 19th century, right? Author of Fear and Trembling. He was a Protestant. So he was worried about the hypocrisy, about the moral implications of the nihilistic kind of life that modernity was bringing upon. And he was going to be someone advocating for the leap of faith, a rescue of the notion, of the ancient notions of the gods of the writings, the gods of the sacred writings, the God that makes the impossible possible, Tertullian, and all these dissidents from the systematic traditional theology. Where does Sartre's atheism fit in? So he says here, there are on the one hand the Christians, amongst whom I shall name Jaspers and Gabriel Marcel, both professed Catholics, and on the other hand the existential atheists, among whom we must place Heidegger as well as the French existentialists and myself, like Beauvoir, like Maurice Merleau-Ponty. What they have in common is simply the fact that they believe that existence comes before essence, or, if you will, that we must begin from the subjective. What exactly do we mean by that? So it's the opposite of Aquinas' metaphysics, Aristotle metaphysics. We do not have a substance that precedes our existence, right? For Aquinas, for example, there are the uns, the uns, and the essence, essentia. The uns is the one that it can be an idea, but it does not necessarily have an existence. So it does, like a unicorn or a goblin. It's something that can exist in our minds, in our culture, but not in the concrete material reality. So a human being, on the other hand, has an existence, has an existence. He is concrete, he's real, he has a substance, an essence, and the essence for Aquinas, for Aristotle, was to be a rational kind of animal who is able to make difficult choices of abstract thinking, capable of abstract thinking, capable of feeling sophisticated emotions, and so on. And for Sartre, this is not really the case. We first are thrown into existence, and then we can think of ideas, of essence, and all this abstract metaphysics. He is also, of course, very much influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, who was the existential philosopher, although not just that, who was mainly responsible for writing about this phenomena of the death of God, which also means the death of metaphysics, of this absolute idea of idealism, of this pretentious, even of pretentious positivism, of any exterior, objective source of value, right? For Nietzsche, as for Sartre, we are the ones that have to create value and meaning. And so this is what he means. And further on he says, atheistic existentialism, of which I am a representative, declares with greater consistency that if God does not exist, there is at least one being whose existence comes before its essence, a being which exists before it can be defined by any conception of it. That being is man, or as Heidegger has it, the human reality, or Dasein. What do we mean by saying that existence precedes essence? We mean that man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. If man, as the existentialist sees him, is not definable, it is because, to begin with, he is nothing. Das nicht. He will not be anything until later, and then he will be what he makes of himself. Thus, there is no human nature, because there is no God to have a conception of it. Man simply is. The first effect of existentialism is that it puts every man in possession of himself as he is, and places the entire responsibility for his existence squarely upon his own shoulders. And when we say that man is responsible for himself, we do not mean that he is responsible only for his own individuality, but also he is responsible for all of mankind, right? So when you make a choice, your choice has impact on the world. It's not just your life, it's everyone. So we do not have, as Kant would want it, or as Aquinas would want it, an objective morality. We have to create a morality. And we have to create it without bad faith, without self-deception. And we are going to talk about that. So, when Sartre talks about this vertiginous liberty, this terrifying freedom, he's of course not celebrating. He's saying that our freedom is an object of despair, of anguish, which is something that's already in Kierkegaard. We are the ones that have to assume the responsibility for our lives. So, if on the one hand, this makes our existence inevitably containing a great deal of anguish, it's this same anguish that can provide meaning for us. Kierkegaard wrote Either Or, where he argues that either choice you make is going to be wrong. When you're faced with two choices, you don't have any guarantees, and you're going to regret it anyway. You're going to speculate what could have been anyway. So you're thrown into the world. You can be a professor, you can be an athlete, you can be a lawyer. You have this absolute sublime realm of potentiality. And what do you do with it? You limit, you narrow your potential. As the years go by, all your potential is going to be eliminated except for the part that you chose, right? That you chose to live by. And that's a very, very small portion of what could have been. And so, as far as we know, we only have this life. And this is the one that matters. So we have to choose with responsibility. So, he writes, the existentialist frankly states that man is in anguish. His meaning is as follows. When a man commits himself to anything, fully realizes that he is not only choosing what he will be, but is thereby at the same time a legislator deciding for the whole of mankind. In such a moment, a man cannot escape from the sense of complete and profound responsibility. The existentialist is strongly opposed to a certain type of secular moralism, which seeks to suppress God at the least possible expense. There is this in common between art and morality, that in both we have to do with creation and invention. We cannot decide a priori what it is that should be done. So here he's making a classic point in aesthetics, which Kant already made in the third critique, which is that art cannot have rules. It's something that comes from the thing. It's not something you impose on the thing, right? There is no reason why you should not, but I declare that you are doing so and that the attitude of strict consistency alone is that of good faith. So here he talks about what could be an indicator of an authentic life. It's the one that is conducted by choices of good faith and not bad faith. A bad faith choice is when you know what you're about to do is wrong, but you do it anyways. Joining a religion you don't really believe in could be something of bad faith, or a political party, or marriage. So you have to be honest with yourself and assume responsibility. So an existentialist will never take man as the end, since man is still to be determined. What I was talking about in the beginning on the issue of humanism. But, says Sartre, there is another sense of the word, of which the fundamental meaning is this. Man is all the time outside of himself. It is in projecting and losing himself beyond himself that he makes man to exist. And on the other hand, it is by pursuing transcendent aims that he himself is able to exist. And he concludes telling a story about a boy, a young man, who lives with his mother, who is going through a very difficult phase in her life, where she just separated from her husband, who was a difficult guy, who was thinking about joining the collaborative side of France, who basically would work with the Nazis. Also, she lost her other son in the war. So the son that remains is actually a student of Sartre, and he goes to the philosopher asking for advice. What should he do? He should stay with his mother or go to war and avenge his brother's death. Well, Sartre tells him that, look, there's no exterior, absolute principle which could orient the choice that you have to make. It's up to you, really. We are all alone in this, and we can make our own choices and deal with them. So nothing I could tell you would be right or would be wrong. The students face, however, a scenario in which he could either go to a war, which is very difficult to predict what would happen, what he would be doing. He could end up in an office somewhere, and he could die in the front and not help anyone at all and cause even more suffering for his mother. On the other hand, he could stay with his mother and be sure he's going to have an impact on one individual's life, a particular important individual for him, which sounds more reasonable. It's really about choosing, really. There's no principle. Nevertheless, by going to Sartre for advice and not, let's say, a priest, he already somehow is making his choice, right? Because he can tell what kind of advice he's going to listen from Sartre and what kinds of advice he would listen from a priest. The young man, as far as I know, he chose to stay with his mother, which is what Sartre wanted, but never told him to not influence the man's authenticity. I also would like to say that when Sartre talks about this freedom, he's not talking about metaphysical free will, right? Because existential philosophers like Nietzsche did not believe in free will. Sartre believes that even it doesn't matter if free will in a metaphysical sense really exists, but our freedom of action exists in our concrete world in a day-to-day basis. So this matters, and what you do with this freedom of action is what is important, and you have to do it with responsibility. So he doesn't really care if there's a God, distant, or a free will of immortality. He deals with the concrete facts of life, and only that. Much in the same way Camus operates in his absurdism, which is similar but not the same thing. Let's read the very last paragraph, the very last sentences of the essay. So Sartre writes, "Existentialism is not atheist in the sense that it would exhaust itself in demonstrations of the non-existence of God. It declares, rather, that even if God existed, that would make no difference from its point of view. Not that we believe God does exist, but we think that the real problem is not that of his existence. What man needs is to find himself again and to understand that nothing can save him from himself, not even a valid proof of the existence of God. In this sense, existentialism is optimistic. It is a doctrine of action, and it is only by self-deception, by confining their own despair with ours, that Christians can describe us as without hope." So I hope you like this lecture. There are other minor points as well when Sartre talks about the work of art and love and how these two things are only real in the sense that we are responsible for their construction, their existence. There's no like soulmate around waiting for you. The only love is the love that is built with hard work, with commitment, and much in the same way, a work of art that exists, an artist's collection is composed of the art pieces that he made, and you could not imagine a play that Racine never wrote or Shakespeare never wrote. It's something that should not be taken into account. The totality of Racine or Friedrich Schiller or Goethe or Shakespeare's work is composed of that very same individual works that these people wrote, and no more than that. And Sartre himself, as I said, was also a literary figure. He wrote Nausée and plays and other fiction books that you should have a look into. And so I guess this is an introduction to existentialism. I will not go into detail of Sartre's entire career and how he later embraced, in a way, Marxism and tried to combine these two doctrines. I'm not even sure if he was successful, but this is the very core of existentialism. I hope you read this book because it's a very good one to start and very easy to read. And if you have any questions, make sure to comment here below in the comment section. Please subscribe, please share the channel. This is not even my main channel. This is an international channel. I have if you happen to know any Portuguese, you can check out my 400 plus videos and lectures of philosophy from a channel I've grown in the past 4 to 5 years, and this one is brand new and I'm still growing it. So share with the world, share with friends and family, and I see you next time.